I think the challenge is to convert that suffering into reaching out and to being part of a community of people that understand what you're going through and that you can understand what they're going through, and then you find meaning.
This is Collapse Club. I'm David Baum in Seattle. My guest is Lisa Gordon from Victoria, BC in Canada. Lisa is a facilitator at the Deep Adaptation Forum, where she's run meetings about anger and responsibility and about Deep Adaptation's founding principles, the 4Rs. We spoke on May 17th, 2024. You mentioned that you were running a workshop about anger. What makes you angry about collapse?
Right. Well, it's not so much necessarily about my anger, but about anger in general when you have such a threat facing society and the natural world and our own survival. There's a real temptation in humans to get really polarized, to want to blame each other, want to scapegoat, whether it's the oil industry or the whatever. It's really easy to pick an enemy and find meaning in the issues in the frame of there's an enemy and a bad guy or gal who or a bad company who's doing all the wrong, and I get to justify my existence because I'm not doing wrong. So that kind of anger, I think, is really toxic in the environmental movement. I've been deeply steeped in that over the years. And I understand it. And I know it's a really deep human tendency to want to have something to blame and simplify the issue that way. And that really does feed anger. So I think with the anger workshop, what we were trying to do was get people to own and feel in their own bodies how they were managing their anger. Were they recognizing what would trigger it? Were they recognizing their responsibility for what their expression then would be? It's one thing to feel anger, it's another thing when you start expressing it and harming other people potentially around you. And just to really get familiar with the physical, emotional, spiritual power and liability of anger. Because I think when people get angry, they externalize a lot. It's all out there. There's not a lot going on in self-awareness anymore. Once you bit the anger bait, and then you're hooked, and it's really hard to come back from it till it plays itself out.
And you were looking for alternatives to that externalization of anger?
Not necessarily, just alternative ways of externalizing the anger. So when you're going to express anger, are you taking responsibility for the parts of it that you can? Or are you making it all about the outside person issue, whatever headline that you read today?
And that responsibility, why is that important?
Well, the fabric of community, family, the world, as we see in war and everything else, can be so easily torn apart by acting out from anger. And of all the things that are going to collapse and the ways they're going to collapse, boy, it would be really nice if we didn't have to go down in an angry pile of war. You know, if we're going to go down, maybe we could go down more lovingly, or at least more consciously. The metaphor of palliative care comes to mind, where you could be really angry at the cancer or the doctors who didn't fix the person with the cancer, or you could sit lovingly beside the person who's suffering and be with that suffering. I think that's the trajectory I'd like to be on anyway. And I can still feel that anger, but I know that it's not actually the truth. It's not the real game. What's really going on is terrible loss and sadness, and natural to experience some anger, but not okay to rip apart the fabric of the community that I'm in with my anger.
So
Yeah.
loss and sadness are at the center of your approach.
Well, I can't help that, I guess. It's not a choice. The loss and sadness comes up, and then it's how will I then respond? And, you know, in my younger years, I certainly responded with a lot of anger and enemy making and wrong making. And I still struggle with that when I'm feeling any kind of suffering. There's a great quote from Parker Palmer, who I studied with at the Center of Courage and Renewal, that violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. It's a wonderful statement. Violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. And I think the Center for Courage and Renewal and Deep Adaptation Forum and the related movements around that are teaching the skills of converting our suffering to something other than violence and anger. And I'm very, very grateful for the ways that they do that.
What are the alternatives to violence in order to deal with our suffering?
Well, I think naming the suffering first, just being really aware that this is what's happening, whether it be hunger or some other form of scarcity or some feeling of threat. I think there's a very deep principle in Indigenous communities and wisdom traditions through the ages that relationship and connection to each other is where real healing happens, and that none of this can happen alone. And so if I am suffering, that my first impulse might be to curl up under a rock or climb into my bed or take a pill or have a drink or gamble or whatever people do with their suffering, or be violent to others or to themselves. I think the challenge is to convert that suffering into reaching out and to being part of a community of people that understand what you're going through and that you can understand what they're going through, and then you find meaning, you find connection, and dare I say love and acceptance. And I think that's the magic sauce of most of the collapse movement directions that I've seen happening, is that they really focus on love. And the deep adaptation movement is about, and the mission phrase is enabling and embodying loving responses to our predicament. It's easily said, not easily done when you're suffering, to turn to or seek the loving response. I'm no prize in that department. I can quickly go to impatience, judgment, blaming, all kinds of bad habits that my mind is very prone to do to try and alleviate my own suffering. But then I'm creating more suffering for others when I do it. So it does not work. It's very dysfunctional. So yeah, the loving response, if possible. And if it's not, then the loving response is to admit that it's not possible. I don't have that available right now, so I'm going to try and do no harm.
Let's talk about the 4 R's. They are at the center of the deep adaptation approach to a loving response to collapse. So, what are they and what do they mean?
Yeah, David, one of the monthly circles that I co-host with Terry LePage is called the 4 R's. And it's an exploration of how we face collapse. And by exploring what they are, we can get closer to what our own loving response is. And it has a big range. And so different times will be available to do different parts of this. The first R that's most familiar to people is resilience. People define that in all different ways. But the prompt that we use in the circle that I co-host is, what do you most value that you want to keep, and how do you want to keep it? It's not a traditional definition of resilience at all, but it does take people pretty deep in terms of what it is that they're worried about losing and what do they want to get back, that sort of thing. So the second one, relinquishment. And we define that in the DA movement as, what do you need to let go of so as not to make matters worse? So you can imagine people's responses to that are often their high consumer lifestyle, their expectations of how the world will be, relinquishing things that if you keep them, they will make matters worse. And if you let go of them, they might make matters better, or at least not make them worse. And the third R is restoration. And we think of that in ecosystem terms for sure. But what else needs to be restored within and around you? What do you want to bring back to support yourself and your community in these times? And that could be like a soft skill kind of thing. What do you want to bring back, like in terms of loving or grieving together? And it could also be a very practical hard skill, like bringing back an urban forest, or bringing back some kind of quality of life that is required to get through these times. A lot of people talk about food resilience and food security in that category. And the final one, reconciliation, with what or with whom will we make peace as we awaken to the nature of collapse and to our mortality, to the suffering that we have? How can we make peace that will reduce the pain of this difficult time for ourselves and others? And people often think about reconciliation in terms of Indigenous repair, but there is so much other repair that can be done too, that whatever's within your reach to repair is something that can add to your loving response.
Are these practices that people do? Or are they concepts, ideas? How do you approach it?
I think the highest form of them is to live them, to commit to say one a day or one a week or all four at once for a year or whatever scope you have, to dedicate yourself to finding some meaning through the chaos. I think what people's experience with that we've heard reported to us is that it does provide a framework or a scaffolding for making sense of the kinds of struggles and cravings and wishes and longings and regrets that people have in their lives. It's a way of containing their wish to do better and their wish to be part of, for lack of a better word, solution. They can latch on to one or more of those things as a path. And so the people who are doing permaculture and growing food, they can anchor that in one of those 4 Rs. The people who are organizing and being political could anchor it in the reconciliation and wanting to create peace in the world. There's a way home, I think, nicely framed by any one of those 4.
The 4 Rs were framed by Jim Bendel and Katie Carr, I think, together. They published the seminal blog post, The Love in Deep Adaptation. For me, it's always been a touchstone, the idea that there can be a loving response to the catastrophe in which we find ourselves. That was the thing that woke me up.
Beautiful.
So I'm very grateful to Jem and to Katie and to everyone else involved with deep adaptation for holding that flame.
Well, I think the metaphor of hospicing and palliative care holds firm for that too, for people who find this all a bit too heady. It's like if the person in the hospital bed is the earth, or is your community, or is whatever it is you love that you're worried is being lost, or that you know for sure is being lost, there is a death sentence on something around you. How will you bring your love to the bedside? It's that simple. And asking the doctors to fix it is one answer, and a lot of people do that. It's natural, but there's another option that might bring more peace for you and the one who's suffering in the bed.
What does it feel like to you to be in attendance at the hospicing of the earth?
That is a lovely question. That drops me really deep. There's a real gravitas to it. It's a very solemn responsibility that gives me a lot of purpose, a lot of focus. And it stops me from being the ranting, raving lunatic that I was in my teens and 20s, alienating everyone around me with my certainty about how everything should be different and how everything was wrong. It brings a tenderness and just a passionate love for knowing just how much we're losing, being able to hold that pain of how much is being lost. Whether it's the northern white rhino having been officially declared extinct, or, what's next? What's the next headline? How to hold that headline and the next in my heart, because my heart's incredibly tender all the time. And I covered it up with political outrage for a long time. And I wasn't willing to feel that pain. And I think being by the bedside of deep loss and staying, not running away, not having a drink, not begging for some kind of relief, just staying in it is a really ancient spiritual practice that I probably haven't had the right teachers for, but maybe I will as I get older. I'm in my 60s, for those who can't tell from my voice. There's still time for me to really learn what it is to be in hospicing the creatures on Earth. I'm not worried about the Earth herself at all, but some of the creatures and the suffering, which includes humans. Yeah, it's a very solemn time. It probably should have more ritual or ceremony or something around it to contain that amount of pain. It can be a really lonely experience, but organizations like Deep Adaptation and organizations like Collapse Club and Work That Reconnects, Center for Courage and Renewal, there are so many wonderful places to turn to now to share that grief and to share the wisdom of how to stay in it without running into destructive behaviors.
That was Lisa Gordon on Collapse Club. For links to Deep Adaptation events, please visit their event calendar at the link in the program notes. Here at Collapse Club, we offer 3 meetings a week where we talk about our experience of collapse. If you feel alone with your knowledge of collapse and need people to talk to, please visit our website at collapseclub.com and sign up for our newsletter. We look forward to seeing you. I'm David Baum in Seattle. Until we meet again, farewell.